much. And the first thing I want to do is thank SACNAS for having me here today. I spoke at a couple of SACNAS events early in my career, probably 25 years ago, but it's been a while, and I'm just so thrilled to see how SACNAS has grown over the years and to see all of you here today. Congratulations on your 45th anniversary, and I always think anniversaries are a great time to reflect on the success that you've had over the last 45 years, but of course also a good time for all of us to think about how we can continue to help encourage diversity in STEM. So one of the things I was going to mention very first of all today was we had a crew that was launching to the International Space Station very early this morning here. And so I was going to talk about them. They should have docked by now, and a little bit about what's currently going on. But if you've seen the news, you probably saw that they had an anomaly during the launch, and the crew needed to do an abort. However, they landed safely, and they're both fine. We had a NASA astronaut and a cosmonaut on board. So I think it serves as a reminder that spaceflight's still hard, and it really requires the best of engineers and scientists to really make it happen, and that we always have to be prepared, and that's something that we really specialized at NASA. The other thing I wanted to mention is, because I hope you all know, but you may not, that the second Latina to go into space is in space right now, living and working on the International Space Station, Serena Auñón-Chancellor. And so I hope you're following along with her mission. You can follow her on Twitter at @AstroSerena. By the way, feel free to tag me at @Astro_Ellen. And you can follow along with her. And if you go outside tonight at 8:52 p.m. and there's not too many clouds, you can see the space station fly over. And there's an even better pass tomorrow at 8 p.m. So just go to your computer and put in Spot the Station, put in San Antonio, and it'll tell you exactly when and where to look. And I hope you all will feel part of the space program by watching the space station fly over and, of course, cheering on Serena. So a few years ago, one of our astronauts returned from the International Space Station, and he talked about living and working on the frontier. And that was a phrase that really kind of spoke to me about the excitement and the challenge of working in human space exploration. And a frontier is a place, it's often an actual place where explorers come and pioneers settle. But sometimes it's more of a metaphor, and I think it's something that we all can relate to, because a frontier is a place where boundaries are pushed. And certainly I've had the opportunity in my career to live and work on the frontier, but many, many of you in this room are also very familiar with frontiers and pushing boundaries. I've had an amazing career with NASA, being able to live and work on the frontier, being able to do research and development in space, helping to assemble the International Space Station and learn how to operate it and how to train for it. And of course, being the first Latina in space and the first Hispanic director of the Johnson Space Center. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about that. My career was really possible for a variety of reasons, certainly the development of the space shuttle and some of the changes going on in our country during the 1970s, but also through my family's focus on education. So my dad's parents were Mexican, and they moved first to Arizona and then to California, and that's where my dad, who was the youngest of 12 kids, was born. And education was important in their family. He was a good student, and he was able to get a tuition-free college education by getting an appointment to the Naval Academy. My mom wasn't able to go to college when she was young. In fact, she didn't even finish high school for health reasons until she was in her 30s. But she always loved learning, and she really passed that on to me and to my 4 brothers and sisters. And during the whole time that she was raising us, we lived in San Diego, a suburb of San Diego, and our local university was San Diego State University. And she would take like a class a semester just for a long time, just because she loved to learn about all different kinds of things. And she eventually did get her college degree a year after I graduated from San Diego State University. But her example really had a big impression on me and my brothers and sisters, and we all went to college. Now, when I went off to college, I had actually no idea what I was going to do. Certainly never thought about the astronaut program at that time, and I wasn't even in science and engineering. I thought maybe I'd major in business or music, but wasn't really sure what exactly that meant for my future or career. I did take a lot of math in high school, and I liked it. I was good at it. And so at San Diego State, I ended up taking more math classes. And when I talked to the people, the other students in those classes, I was finishing up the calculus series. I was asking them, what they were taking, and most of them were in engineering, also physics. And they asked me what I was in there for, and I said, well, just for fun. I like calculus, But they're like, maybe you should go find out, what subjects actually use calculus. And so I went to talk to a couple different professors at San Diego State University. One was in the electrical engineering department. And, this professor, to be honest, was pretty discouraging. He was like, well, we had a woman come through the program once, and, it's a pretty difficult program. And, he was picking up different components on his desk, like capacitors and things, and saying, you'll have to work with these. I really don't know that that's something you'd be interested in. But then I went to talk to a physics professor. And so one of the first things he asked about was my math background, and when I told him what I had already studied, he just got really excited. He said, that's terrific. He said, you've already learned the language of physics. And so, if you come to our major and take our classes, you'll be able to focus on the concepts, whereas the other students will be doing that simultaneously. And he said, I think you do really well. And then the other important thing he told me was, here's some careers that you can do when you major in physics. And that was really important to me because, to be honest, I wasn't completely sure what physics was. And I really, I didn't know any scientists. I didn't know any engineers. I'm sure I share that with many of you in this room. So I couldn't really picture what a career was or what somebody did with a major in physics. So it was really important that he helped to paint that picture. And after those two conversations, it's probably not too surprising that I actually chose physics as my major at that point. I also had the opportunity to attend a conference at San Diego State that was put on by Women in Science and Engineering. And there were a number of women who came and talked about what their job was really like. And that was also really important to me. So I know there are so many people here. There are professors, there are professionals. I just hope you understand how important the words that you say to the students coming up are. You can see how it affected my career. And even for the students here, the graduate students, undergraduate career, you have that opportunity to talk to and affect high school students and middle school students, and what you say can really be very important for their future. I had the opportunity while I was at San Diego State to spend a couple different summers working in a research lab. And at one of them, I was actually mentored by one of the women staff members there, one of the very, very few women staff members there. And she was really the first one that talked to me about graduate school. She asked me if I liked doing research, and I said, yeah, I'm just getting a first taste of it, but I enjoy it. It's something I might want to do. And she said, well, then graduate school is really important. She actually mentioned the name of a professor at Stanford that had recently come to their lab to speak. And what it turned out is about a year or two later, I was actually at Stanford as a graduate student working for that specific professor who became my PhD advisor. And in fact, I'm still in contact with him today, and he's really been a supporter of mine over the years. So it was while I was at Stanford, actually in the first year there when I was getting my master's, that the space shuttle flew for the first time. And that was a big deal because it was a very different kind of spacecraft than we had ever flown in the United States before. And it had so many more capabilities than you have in a capsule design. And a lot of what it was designed to do was science and engineering research in space. And because of that, a few years before, when NASA was selecting the first group of astronauts that would actually fly on the space shuttle, they realized they needed scientists, they needed engineers, they needed medical doctors, all these people who could perform the research in space. And it really expanded the view of who they would look at for astronauts. And that, along with the equal rights movement and the civil rights movement in the country, opened up the astronaut corps for the very first time for women and minorities. And the first class that included them, of course, was the 1978 class. So again, in '81 is when it flew for the first time. 2 years later, Sally Ride flew in space, another huge march forward, first American woman in space. And when I looked at Sally from afar, you know, I could see that we had some connections. Not only that we were both women, of course, but she had majored in physics, as I had. She had gone to Stanford, which is where I was at the moment. And those connections really helped me dream much bigger than I would have otherwise, and start to think about, you know, the astronaut program, and is that something that I could really possibly be a part of. I can say I basically almost talked myself out of it, just thinking, you know, there's so many thousands of other people who apply, and they're probably way more, you know, qualified than I am. So one of the things we always have to watch out for is not to talk ourselves out of these potential opportunities and these dreams that we have, but instead just try to work toward them and find those people who will help encourage you. I certainly had the encouragement of my thesis advisors. When I went off to I applied for the program as soon as I got my PhD, but I never actually expected to hear back from NASA. So I went off to, first of all, Sandia National Labs. I worked in Livermore, California, and was able to do research there. And between my work at Stanford and Sandia, was a co-inventor on 3 patents during that time, as well as a number of journal articles as well. But while I was at Sandia, I did get called by NASA to come for to interview at Johnson Space Center. And I didn't know it till I got there, but that meant that out of a few thousand applications, I was down to one of about 120 people that they actually invited to come interview. It was my first chance to be at a NASA center, and of course, Johnson Space Center, the home of human spaceflight. Got to meet and talk with other astronauts for the first time, find out a little bit more about what the job was like. Got to tour around and see the training facilities. Got lots and lots and lots of medical testing, and had the chance to interview. And I wasn't selected that year, but I was even more excited about going for it in the future. And I realized, you know, some holes in my background. One of them being, I mainly had an academic and research background, and of course, as an astronaut, you work in an operational environment, and they want to make sure that you can operate in an environment where things are happening quickly, where you have to prioritize information, make decisions. So one of the things I did after that was get a private pilot's license to help give me some of that experience. I also decided I wanted to work for NASA, you know, even if I never was selected as an astronaut, because I was interested in space exploration and really of being part of something bigger than myself, working as part of a team. So I went off to NASA Ames Research Center in Northern California, and after just 6 months was actually offered a position as a supervisor of a group of about 35 people. So 3 years after that initial interview, I was called, the next selection was happening for astronauts, and I was called to interview again. And that was the year that I was selected, 1990, and went off to Johnson Space Center, where I spent the next 28 years. And just as I hoped when I first thought about the astronaut program, was my first 2 flights were part of doing science research in space. And those missions were specifically focused on atmospheric research and the problem of ozone depletion and the ozone hole. And we had a whole suite of instruments in the payload bay, and we were trying to understand, you know, what was really causing the ozone hole and ozone depletion, and how much of it was due to human activities, and how much of it was due to the natural solar cycle of the sun. And some of the instruments that we were using were optical instruments, so I was pretty familiar with how they operated. And of course, part of my job was to actually explain to the public what it is that we were doing on that mission and how these instruments were helping us collect the data that would help us understand more about our atmosphere. So after those first 2 missions, I then had the opportunity to start to support the International Space Station program. And at this time, this was the mid-1990s, it was not too long after we had joined forces with the Russian Space Agency. And of course, we were already working with the European, Japanese, and Canadian space agencies on this project. And so we were sort of in the midst of a redesign and just starting to develop hardware and get into more of the details of the design, but also trying to figure out how we were actually going to operate the space station. So one of my jobs became, going to Russia, negotiating with members of the Russian Space Agency and some of their contractors, and really trying to figure out, how is a joint crew going to operate on the station? How are we going to select those crews? What language are we going to speak during training? What language are we going to speak on the International Space Station? Just all of those things, we had to put together that whole operational concept. So it was an incredible time to be involved in that. And a few years later, one of the other jobs that I got to do was to lead the group of astronauts that work in mission control. They're called CAPCOMs because they're the ones that communicate with the astronauts on board. And we had to transform our mission control center from one that operated, usually 10 days at a time or so during a shuttle mission, to one that was going to operate 24/7 well into the future, and understand how that was going to work and how we were best going to support a mission that was now going to be day in and day out. And I hope you know that we've now had astronauts and cosmonauts on orbit. Next month, it will be 18 years straight. So for anybody who is a senior in high school this year, every minute that they've been alive, we've had our astronauts in space, and we've been able to keep them safe and productive and doing research in a whole variety of areas. And that's one of the things that I have loved being involved with. And the third and fourth missions that I had on the space station, thank you. The third and fourth missions that I was able to fly on in the astronaut office were part of assembling the International Space Station. One of them was the very first shuttle to dock with the station. This was back in 1999. It was only 2 modules, one that had been launched from Russia, one that had been launched from the US. There were no people living on board yet because we didn't have a habitation module. So our job was to go up and transfer supplies both inside and outside in order to prepare it for the first crew. And then I got to go back 3 years later when the station, of course, was much larger. We had a crew of 3 living on board. We were still in the middle of assembly. And our crew brought up the very first piece of the truss structure. It was about 40 feet long, and we added it to the station. And that truss structure, of course, now is about 350 feet long, and the 4 large solar arrays hang off it, and those are what power the entire station, including the US laboratory and laboratories that have been put up by the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency. So getting a chance to be a part of that assembly was, an absolute highlight in my career. After my 4th mission is when I really had the opportunity to go into management and leadership positions at Johnson Space Center. First as deputy and then as director of the organization that managed the astronaut office and our aircraft ops division, and then as deputy center director, and finally for the last 5.5 years, up until May when I retired, as the director of Johnson Space Center. And I do want to say, every person I've ever worked for in my career has been a man, and yet they have all been so very supportive of my career, and they provided me lots of opportunities. So I want to make sure, we're all in this together, right? We need to provide that support and encouragement to those who are coming up behind us, and to provide the opportunities so that each of us can reach our potential. I also learned how important it was to kind of find my own voice. to speak up, to understand where I could add value in the meetings that I supported and in leading people. It's been a hugely exciting time over that time. We, of course, finished the assembly of the International Space Station during the time that I was in management. And we've had a real focus on moving forward at Johnson Space Center. As center director, I had an initiative called JSC 2.0, and it was about advancing human spaceflight by being lean, agile, and adaptive to change. And I think that's something that all organizations have that same challenge of how do we move forward, how do we innovate, especially if we've been successful in how we're operating today. But we know that the world changes. And of course, there's all kinds of changes going on in human spaceflight. We have a lot more companies involved now. A lot of them have just started up in the last 10 years or so. NASA works with all of those companies, and we've had to figure out a new way of working with them, where they actually own the spacecraft and the rockets that they use, and we buy services from them, and they operate them. And we work together in a way that was different than the way we worked in our history. One of the things that we focused on in order to help innovate is the idea of tying innovation and inclusion together, because it's really voices coming from all different kinds of backgrounds that help bring us new ideas. And it's also really imperative that we use and value every single person that we have at Johnson Space Center. And that, to me, was so important for inclusion. It's the right thing to do, but it's also an imperative for us to be successful and for us to be safe. If there are people at our center that had a concern about a safety issue, something that could actually affect the lives of our astronauts, if they're not feeling valued or respected, they may hesitate to speak up. We may not hear that voice, and it could lead directly to a tragedy for us. So it's absolutely critical that all of our folks feel valued, feel respected, and know they can speak up. And one of the mechanisms we used was employee resource groups. And of course, we have a very thriving Hispanic employee resource group who has added so much to our center, and in fact was recognized by the White House 2 or 3 years ago as part of their Hispanic education initiative because of the great work that we do. And we tried to develop all kinds of processes that would make sure that we were trying to include all of the people who worked at Johnson Space Center. So I wanted to say just in the final minute or two that I'm up here a little bit about what I'm doing now since I retired from NASA in May. One of the main activities that I do is I'm the vice chair of the National Science Board. And the NSB has 2 roles. It governs the National Science Foundation. So I'm very thrilled that this conference is partially funded by the National Science Foundation, which is important to me and to our country. And their other role is to provide science and engineering advice to the nation. And so I'm still very, very involved in STEM. And one of the things I mentioned, which I think speaks to a lot of the messages that some of our previous speakers today have talked about, is I hope that you have noticed that just in the last few months, a lot of these government and professional organizations like NASA, like NSF, like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, have all recently updated and given a lot of attention to policies related to harassment. And they are really working hard to ensure that we improve the culture that we have for everybody that works in our organizations, whether it's STEM related or not. But I'm very happy to see that these STEM related organizations are working that. And it is important to these organizations, I can tell you, being a part of them, that it is important. And when I look out and I see the thousands of you here and the great work that you are doing, I'm very, very optimistic for the future. And I want to thank you again for having me today as your speaker.